Hello and welcome to the Little Knowledge Podcast, where this time around we have reached, believe it or not, count them, part 3 of the Morgans and Tredegar house. Somehow we have staggered bleary-eyed into the 19th century. And what this thing, well, actually, I think, Goff, what this does prove, this episode, if nothing else, is money doesn't buy you everything.
Yeah.
As we will go on to.
Yes.
My name is Paul Busby, and with me, as ever, is... Did I say that with an exasperated sigh? I kind of did.
Slightly.
Sorry, I didn't mean it.
Weariness.
I didn't mean it that way.
Usual.
It's here again.
Yeah.
He can't take a hint. That man himself, Goff Morgan. Hello, Goff.
Hello.
Sorry about that. That was terrible.
Greetings to you. I hope you're pleased to see me anyway.
If I'm boring myself during the introduction, what hope have we got? I do apologise, everybody. You can never be bored in Goff Morgan's company. He says,
No.
backtracking very quickly.
No, because I get very vicious.
He has that side to him, that edge to him.
Show interest in me.
How are you, Goff?
Okay, thank you. Bumbling along nicely. I got a couple of nice days off and been meeting up with chums, and it's been very admirable day and a week so far. Yeah.
So are you ready?
Hideously wrong today, but apart from that,
are you ready to talk Morgans?
I am. Yes, indeed.
All right then.
We are now, as you said, we've tackled the early origins in part 1. We got through right up to the end of the first Morgan dynasty in 1793 with the last male line of the Morgans, John Morgan. So they ostensibly die out at that point. Here he is. So now we're going to crack on past what could have been the end of the Morgans and into second dynasty Morgans and talk about how that came about and how the family really rocketed up the ladder in the 19th century.
They did a good job. But before we leave John, the last male Morgan of the direct line, if you're being strict about it, as you say, he dies in 1792. And his funeral, there's actually an account of how Tredegar House was set up before the funeral.
Oh, interesting. Oh, yeah.
So in the brown parlour lay the corpse, with the windows just closed to cast an additional gloominess on the room into which every person had access. There were no lights in the daytime, and the sofas and chairs were covered with their usual covering. At the great hall door, on each side of it stood 2 porters or mutes with their staves. In the hall was spread the great table, covered with a cold collation of hams, fowls, beef, etc., for the refreshment of the bettermost sort of farmers in the first place, and then others could take their pick. No wine was introduced into the hall. Best parlour, which soon became the dining room under the Goulds, was spread a range of tables with jellies, wines, cakes for gentlemen as attended, to whom silk hatbands and gloves were given. That's what we've got about that for a funeral. Now, as you said, taken over and changing his name by royal license, because this man, Sir Charles Gould, had married John's sister, Jane Morgan, and he took over the estate by changing by royal license his name from Gould to Morgan. So we have Sir Charles Gould Morgan here with Horse Guards parade in the background, because Sir Charles Gould Morgan is the longest serving Judge Advocate General in history. He has been called by some people the founding father of modern military legal thought. This was a man with heft.
Yeah.
His home in London was the Jags residence, which was number 12 Downing Street.
Yes.
An extremely brilliant man who we will talk about in a little while. But first of all, Tredegar House itself. The last time we saw an image of Tredegar House, it looked something like this.
Yes.
It has a cupola, this thing here, on the roof. The roof is rather steep, and it is lovely red brick. But even before he died, John Morgan, the last Morgan, employed a man called Adam Mickle. And Adam Mickle was a landscape gardener, and he came up with this grand sweeping idea of getting rid of all the formality of the house grounds and gardens, sweeping away most of the oak avenues, digging a lake, and bringing nature capability, brown style, right up to the front door of the house. So it started before Gould, and this is 1791, and it's called Building the Lake.
Oh, gosh. Yeah.
So the year before John Morgan died, what you can actually see here are the walls of the old, very formal 17th century court. You might think, but they're here now. Well, they're here now. They were torn down in Gould's time to bring, nature up to the house. But David Freeman, the curator of Tredegar House, put them back in 1987.
That's right. Yeah, when they rediscovered the courtyard, wasn't it?
That's right, to give it back that 17th century look.
Yeah, because they virtually just put turf over the top of the courtyard, didn't they?
And a fountain.
And then they just found it underneath turf. So as soon as the courtyard came back up, they reinstated the wall. Oh, how very, very different, isn't it? Yeah.
It's not a terribly accurate one, this. If I zoom in, you can see this. There are no swags underneath the first floor windows, which is Tredegar House's calling card. They appear to have got rid of the side Edney gate here. So it's not terribly historically accurate, but it does give you the image of all of a sudden the parkland coming right up to the front door of the house.
Yeah.
There is a much better one here.
Oh, yes.
You got the side Edney gate. And what you can see here is the side. If you go to Tredegar House today, you will see a porch where this window is.
Yes.
But as you can see, in the 19th century, in the first half of the 19th century, the side door was here.
Yeah.
Where there is now a window.
Yeah.
They've got rid of the cupola. They've changed the angle of the roof, which infuriated Octavius Morgan, a man we'll talk about a bit later on. He said that was his dad's worst mistake.
Oh, gosh.
It made the roof far less elegant.
Yeah.
And you got this lake now finished.
Oh, gosh, yes.
This is a bit later again, but it enforces the fact that it's right up. Nature's right up to the front door of Tredegar House.
Oh, but that's got the steep roof on it. Is that a bad drawing or just
it's a bad drawing
before they changed the roof?
No, it's not a great drawing.
All right.
Although interestingly, you can still see the door is still there.
Oh yeah, of course, yes.
Which means this is pre-1877 at least.
Oh right.
And you've got the lake. Now it's not the best drawing in the world. This one, unfortunately. Who's this? Lady de Souza, I think. Lady de Saumarez, sorry, Lady de Saumarez. So it would be the 1870s, this. Again, look how ornate the stables look. When the stables were built, stables really did not have external ornamentation.
Oh, yeah, no.
Well, the Tredegar stables stick out a mile.
Yeah.
Very countrified. Let's go back to Charlie Gould. So he's changed his name to Sir Charles Gould Morgan, and essentially what he does...
Now, before we go on, this changing of the name, was it part of... Because obviously John knew that he wasn't going to get an heir.
Yeah. Well, he didn't know that.
He knew that his sister would inherit, and therefore the thing would... Pardon?
He didn't know that. He feared it. Remember, when he died, Louisa was pregnant. His wife was pregnant.
Yeah. But again, they really been terribly unlucky with children, hadn't they? They lost so many. And very, miscarriages and infant deaths as well. But the part didn't he make a deal that he could that he would get the property only if he took the name, or was it just an agreement between them that he would take the name if he inherited it?
To be honest,
you talk about Jane inheriting, but of course in those days every bit of property went to her husband, so effectively Charlie Gould inherited.
Exactly. I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, John put it in his will. I think as a legally enforceable thing, it can only be a request, right?
Oh, right. So it was requested in John's will that he change his name to Morgan.
Because I would say, well, who else would the estate go to? It's got to go somewhere.
Well, quite, yeah. And it went, the line carries down from the female line of the sister.
Yeah.
Interesting.
But by the way, this painting for years, we thought it was by William Hall, the great painter from Bath, but it's actually by a chap called Mather Brown, who was born in Boston, Massachusetts, and painted the earliest portrait of Thomas Jefferson. He painted Adams. He came to Britain, and everything was going well until the 1790s. Way it is with an artist, everything dried up. He didn't get into the Royal Academy. He moved to Manchester, died penniless.
Oh gosh, never.
But we have his portrait, we think, of Sir Charles Gould Morgan. And what he did was he essentially...
On the letter, it just says Charles Morgan Esquire.
Yeah. Well, it's the change of name.
Yeah, so you wonder that's why the letter's there, I think. Is it to show the change of name?
Quite possibly. And you've got Horse Guards Parade in the background.
Yeah.
A great favourite of King George III, apparently.
Oh.
Which in the end, unfortunately, his job worked against him. because he always wanted a peerage, but as Judge Advocate General, he did meet with King George III, so he did see the king up close, so to speak.
Oh, right.
And his eccentricities.
Yeah.
Which turned into the madness of King George.
Yeah.
And so what Charles Gould actually did, because he'd seen it, so, if anyone sees The Madness of King George, the film, Charles Gould was there at that time in the 1780s, and he voted for the regency.
Oh, interesting.
At that early time. So what they think is George III said, anyone who voted for the regency is not getting a peerage during my reign.
Oh, gosh.
And many think that's why, although he had the heft, he had the estate, that Sir Charles Gould Morgan never got a peerage because he voted for the regency.
Oh, how interesting. But then he voted for the regency because he saw the king up close.
Exactly.
Sense.
Of course, now we don't think it's porphyria. We think he was bipolar, George III. That's the current
oh, is it?
Historical, medical
there's all sorts
opinion.
of problems with it. I don't think you can really change it because there's some evidence of possibility of Tourette's as well. Because of the way he would get he would blurt out what all the time.
Yeah.
So I don't think you're ever going to be able to diagnose properly what happened with the king.
No, maybe not. But we do know one thing about Sir Charles Gould Morgan. He was brilliant. Not only did he decide to sort out the Tredegar estate. Now, there were mitigating circumstances, admittedly, but I remind you again that there was a Tredegar estate property near St. Woolas Cathedral who hadn't paid rent for 19 years. The Tredegar estate was awfully run.
Yeah.
And there were legal battles in the 18th century.
Well, that's it. It was more or less mothballed right at the end, wasn't it, really? It was in a parlour state. They'd inherited a very bad, a quite slightly run-down house and a slightly mismanaged estate. And after 19 years legal case as well, it was not at its peak when he was taken over, was it?
To say the least.
Yeah.
There's a guy called Nathaniel Wraxall who quite frankly, as Octavius Morgan later said, talked through his hat. He published this terrible anecdote about Sir Charles Gould going up to his boss, because he married the boss's daughter, General Thomas Morgan of Rupera Castle, and saying, I want to propose to your daughter. And apparently General Thomas Morgan said, well, I got two daughters. I'm putting £1,000 for one and 1,500 for the other. One is plain, one is beautiful.
Oh.
And Charles Gould is essentially said to have said, well, which one's the elder? And Morgan said, well, the elder is the plain one. And Gould said, I'll take her.
Oh, God.
And that's nonsense, because Wraxall would have been about 6 when this happened. And
I
he
see.
his eyewitness. And as Octavius Morgan points out, there is no way that Gould could possibly have thought he would inherit the Tredegar estate, because at the time he married the boss's daughter, he had 3 brothers alive.
Oh, right, yeah, exactly, yeah.
So it doesn't quite work.
No,
Tell you who did love Charles Gould Morgan, though, and that was the Equitable Life Assurance Society. He was its, not its first president, but its best.
Oh, right, okay.
He took over the world's first life assurance society when it wasn't really working, and after he took over, it did work. And the man was brilliant. So what they did was they threw honours at him. They got Thomas Gainsborough to paint a full-length portrait of Sir Charles Gould, and until the unpleasantness, it was in their boardroom in London.
Yeah.
It is.
Oh, right.
And they wanted to give him something.
Yeah.
So in the end, a modest man that he is, he plumped for a solid gold cup. Gift to their president from the Equitable Life Assurance Society.
Oh, my gosh.
Solid gold cup.
I love the box it comes in as well, isn't that?
I think it's amazing the box has survived. Yeah. It went at auction when Equitable Life sold it. The Gainsborough went for 1.1 million.
Blimey.
And at one point, it's very sweet. At one point, I remember people thinking, I wonder if Tredegar House will put a bid in for the Gainsborough. People fainting at the Civic Centre.
Yeah.
I think this cup went for about 100 grand. So it's
oh, gosh.
Expensive stuff. But one of the things Gould did was he was the one, or Gould Morgan, as I should now call him, he was the one that worked out that what was beneath the soil of the Tredegar estate was far more valuable than the many, many farms above ground, shall we say.
Yeah. Right. Because when he took over, it is still essentially an agricultural estate, isn't it?
Yeah, there was a forge in Tredegar Park from the 17th century, but the full potential of the estate hadn't been realised until Gould laid the foundations for the wealth that was to follow.
Hmm.
And so he was the one that gave the green light to this Park Mile Railway.
Yeah.
And that became known as the Golden Mile because, of course, Newport was the natural outlet for all of this, iron and coal rumbling down from the valleys during the Industrial Revolution. And
But this is a tramway, isn't it?
Initially, yes.
Initially, because it predates sort of passenger transport travel and stuff like that.
Initially, it's a tram road. And it enters the park at Pye Corner at Baselig. And it rumbles through the park for about a mile before leaving not far from where I am now, actually, and sort of what we now would say the Maze Glass area, the Gare area. And because Gould Morgan was so brilliant, he essentially did a deal where no rates were paid on that line at all. There was only 1 mile that passed through Tredegar Park, and as long as they could upkeep it, they got to keep. Basically, everything was weighed, the tolls. So for 1 mile, everything was weighed, and a toll was paid to Sir Charles Gould Morgan for every mile, and the numbers are incredible. In 1833, for instance, it was making just that 1 mile of tram road £3,000 a year. Tax-free.
Oh, tax-free?
3,000 tax-free in 1833. By 1883, it was estimated that 4 million tons of freight had gone through that mile of tram road, making tax-free £10,000 a year.
Heaven's sake.
I mean, it's extraordinary. And it is all because of Gould Morgan.
Yeah.
And although the Morgans didn't own mines and ironworks, they owned the land, they leased the land. But the clever thing was, even then, Gould Morgan kept it in the family. Because the man running the Tredegar Ironworks was Samuel Humphrey, who just happened to marry Gould Morgan's daughter.
Yeah, yes, yeah.
They supply the land, they keep it in the family, and they make an absolute fortune. So if there's one pivotal character in the history of Tredegar House, it's not the most glamorous. The most brilliant is probably Sir Charles Gould Morgan. I don't know what you think.
Well, yeah, he's the one that actually, turned them for being just wealthy local gentry into some astronomical, political and economic power base, didn't he? He starts off that whole rise of 19th century industrial and commercial activity. Makes them absolutely rolling in it by the time you get to the latter part of the Victorian period. They are incredible, and it's all off the basis of him, isn't it? The others didn't have the vision to do it.
No, and you've got these sort of boundary markers here, one of which was accidentally demolished back at the start of the 2000s, but the bits are at Tredegar House now.
Oh, right.
They were dropped off. There was a friend of Tredegar called Mr. Brewer, who was trying to get them listed.
Yeah.
And working hard on them. So there were 3 of them, one of which is at Tredegar House, and the other 2 are still around. This is a 1960s picture. It's kind of doesn't look quite as good as it does in that now.
Yeah.
So the reason I keep calling him Gould Morgan, even though his scrap of paper says Sir Charles Morgan, is if you told anybody the name Sir Charles Morgan in Newport of the 19th century, it meant only one man. It meant Sir Charles Gould Morgan, who died in 1806. It's his son.
Yeah.
Sir Charles Morgan.
Ah,
the second baronet.
He dropped all the Gould altogether, didn't he?
Oh, he was on a Welsh kick.
Yeah, very much so. Isn't it interesting? In terms of what we think about now as identity politics, he really buys in to his mother's Welsh identity and not his father's. Even though he was born a Gould, wasn't he?
Mm-hmm.
He's an adopted Welsh man, he adopts the Welsh identity. I find that intriguing. I wonder why he did that.
Well, I know why. I can't look into his heart. I mean, his heart might be that he did follow the call of his mother, and his mother's side of the family, and the fact the Morgans were far more illustrious than the Goulds, for instance. But of course, it's very clever politics. You're building a brand.
Oh yes, yeah.
You want to win election? If you want to keep your power base politically, you better make sure you're Welsh, because the Morgans were this old Welsh clan of a family.
Yeah.
And so if you're a Gould, you're an outsider. You've got to prove yourself a Morgan. What better way could there be than attempting to learn Welsh, however limited, supporting every Welsh society going, and embracing that.
Yeah.
So either way, you're onto a winner, aren't you?
Oh, yeah.
Heart and head.
Yeah. Yeah.
But before we go into Sir Charles, we have to go back to when he was a young man. As you quite rightly say, Goff, although I'll call him Sir Charles from now on, so you know who I'm talking about.
Yeah.
He was in the Coldstream Guards during the American War of Independence as Captain Charles Gould. And that's when the Asgill affair happened. Because Sir Charles was with Cornwallis at Yorktown.
Oh, right, that's good.
Yorktown. The surrender of the British forces. This is a patriotic painting that by a guy called, I think it's Trumbull, I forget. But this is Yorktown. So the British surrender to the Americans and the French, and Sir Charles is taken as a prisoner of war. Now, a problem happens, this terrible tit-for-tat sort of thing. What happens was a loyalist is killed by a patriot as they call them, right? So an American patriot kills a loyalist for no reason whatsoever, essentially other than his politics. And so the British capture the man and execute him. Well, George Washington doesn't like that. George Washington decides a tit for tat. George Washington does not come out of this with any credit, unfortunately. It's the one sort of blot on his escutcheon. No cherry tree will get him out of this one. Because he orders officers that had surrendered, under, terms of a treaty, 13 of them, including Sir Charles, the young Sir Charles, one of them is going to be executed as a reprisal, which goes against everything that they'd signed in the surrender at Yorktown. So the idea is they go to a place, what was it called? The Great Bear Tavern, I think, in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And there are 13 pieces of paper, and they get a drummer boy, and 12 pieces of paper are blank, and one has the word unfortunate written on it.
Fortunate.
If you get the unfortunate, you will be executed by Washington's forces at some point in the future. This has now become a great scandal, you see. This is a great problem.
Yeah.
Sir Charles is one of the 13. The drummer boy, for him, pulls out blank. But for his very close friend, Captain Asgill, unfortunate.
Yeah.
Now, unfortunately for Sir Charles, around about the same time, his younger brother, John Gould, gets killed in a naval engagement called the Battle of the Saints under the famous Admiral Lord Rodney, who we will come to. So because he's lost his brother and various other things, and Gould is immensely powerful among military legal matters, Sir Charles gets sent home. And as he gets sent home, Asgill says to his friend, could you let my mother know? So she knows what's going on. And this became a cause célèbre. This became quite famous. But Sir Charles is not exactly a diplomat. So he turns up at Richmond, at Asgill House, and he walks in the front door, and the butler lets him in, and he goes into the drawing room, and there is Lady Asgill with, I think, her sister. So anyway, he blurts this out. Lady Asgill immediately faints. So does the sister. At this point, Sir Charles panics, rings for the servant. The butler comes in and assumes that Sir Charles must have killed his mistress.
What? Yeah, logical assumption.
Well, the butler was obviously slightly jumpy. But ultimately what happens is Lady Asgill is not without influence in the French court. So what she does is she gets in touch with the Comte de Vergennes, who was the foreign minister, who gets in touch with the king and Marie Antoinette. And some sources say it was Marie Antoinette herself that intervened to save the life of Captain Asgill.
Right.
So it's a nice little story. It would be more dramatic had it been Sir Charles who was saved by Marie Antoinette, but you can't have everything.
No. He was a key cog in the story, wasn't he?
He was a cog. He made a mess of it, but he was a cog. Now, I tried, of course, I have to try this once every podcast now for our many fans who just love this. AI imaging. I tried to recreate Sir Charles and Lady Asgill.
Yeah.
So here he is. It didn't turn out the way I'd hoped. I mean, Sir Charles looks far too Hollywood film star there.
Yeah.
And I don't know why Lady Asgill's smiling.
Smirking in a very slightly deranged
Smirking.
way. Yeah.
And anyway, I said to try to make her faint. I tried this. It doesn't do fainting very well.
Oh.
The fun bit about this is the portraits on the wall.
I know.
They're all of her in the same dress.
Yeah.
Which actually ties very nicely into how Sir Charles ran Tredegar. Because there were many, many portraits of Sir Charles when he became the baronet.
Yeah.
And this bust was everywhere.
Yes.
God,
and there were hundreds of them as well.
Open every cupboard and there's... It's done by John Evans Thomas, who the great Welsh sculptor, really. Now, he's the one that did, if any of you know Brecon, he did the Duke of Wellington's statue in Brecon.
Oh.
And he did Sir Charles Morgan's statue in Newport. And he did this bust of Sir Charles looking very Roman emperor-y.
Yeah.
But there were so many of them. You know, the nuns, when it was a school, didn't have an awful lot of money. And one person told me the story of, I think when the road was altered near the lodge gates, became much more busy, someone had driven directly into the lodge gates. They called out a local firm. The firm come along, they fixed the gates. They trudge up to the front door of what is now St. Joseph's Convent School.
Yeah.
I think it was Sister Pauline who talked to them and did the usual thing, which the nuns did, because they're pretty much penniless.
Yeah.
And they said, oh, thank you so much for that. I'm terribly sorry, but we haven't got any money to pay you. Would you like this bust of Sir Charles Morgan instead? This was currency for the nuns. There were so many of these things.
Break open another Sir Charles.
Break open another one. There are a few at Tredegar House today, and one came on the market a few years ago, and somebody actually slightly outraged said, why aren't the National Trust going for it? Because the last thing the National Trust need is another one of these heads clogging up the rooms. To be perfectly blunt.
Not even another Sir Charles bust.
Too many Sir Charleses. It was said, however, though, that Sir Charles was very susceptible to flattery. You do have lots of portraits of him, very susceptible to flattery. If you poured honey words in his ear, he'd do anything for you. But it was said towards the end, when he was an elderly gentleman, that they tried to keep him away from, this is the word used, from predatory women. Because his wife died his wife didn't really see his Tredegar House reign. She died in 1807.
Oh gosh, only 1 year after.
So when he was at Tredegar, he was allowed to keep 12 Downing Street for an extra year because of his wife's health, which was his dad's old place, of course.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, he was a bit prickly. And so when he didn't get a peerage, he moaned about it. And so they basically said, well, we're never giving him one.
Oh.
So even though, again, like his dad, he had the money, he had the stand-in, but they just wouldn't give him a peerage. Same as his dad. But these honeyed words meant that Sir Charles Morgan enjoyed the nice parts of running the Tredegar estate. Of course, giving as you always say, Goff, giving mince pies to orphans at Christmas.
Pies to orphans.
And he was a very generous man. He was a very nice man. Pleasant.
Yeah.
Out of all the Morgans personality-wise, I think Sir Charles Morgan is really up there.
Yeah.
But, it's an estate. You got to be ruthless. So what Sir Charles does is he gets someone who can be ruthless.
Oh.
Did you shudder then, Goff?
Keep the children away from the fire. Yeah. This is the notorious Thomas Prothero of Malpas Court, latterly of Malpas Court.
Thomas Prothero.
Thomas Prothero. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I have to use that.
And then we have a whole podcast just on him. In fact, it was our very first podcast was on Thomas Prothero. So if you want to scroll back through our offerings, you will find much more detail on this extraordinarily appalling human being.
He is the attack dog, essentially.
Yeah.
And so he becomes agent of the Tredegar estate at an extremely ridiculously young age for the power that a Tredegar agent has. And I think it's because he knew what to say to Sir Charles. And I think he got the job, and he did the job very well, as in the money came in. But he was ruthless with his rent gathering. He had his solicitors in Newport, and pretty soon all the business of the town flowed through Prothero and Phillips. He clashed almost a lifelong feud with the man who became the Chartist leader, John Frost.
Yes.
And he was, oh dear me, he was like a wild animal loose on the county, wasn't he, Goff?
Well, yeah, I mean, he was he being a lawyer, he knew exactly how far he could bend the law without breaking it, and he bent it to its maximum. He was a cunning and ruthless individual in those fashion of the day of the self-made men. He had a very poor beginning. I mean, Frost at one point says he arrived in Newport with nothing but the shirt on his own back. And he then and by the end of his life, he was just, he was like a big fat spider of every single thing that was going on in Newport. He had fingers in so many pies. He had ability to place people in local government positions and place people in. And he stitched up a coal monopoly virtually with Thomas Dufferin. Astonishing. So yeah, but you didn't tangle with him because he would destroy you if he could do it. And brought many people down. This is when the continual head-butting between him and John Frost takes place, which goes right back from a personal grievance when he gypped John Frost out of some money over an argument with a will. And it goes back in about 1822, when their offices were in the same street. So Frost's draper's office shop was in Thomas Street, and Prothero's office was also in Thomas Street, and that rub
High Street,
I beg your pardon. Yeah, where it goes on and on and on and on and on, and until and so eventually he gets John Frost imprisoned in Cold Bath Farm, accuse him of libel, and of course Frost can't write to him anymore. He's forbidden to write to him or write about him. So Frost attacks him by writing to Sir Charles Morgan. So there are loads and loads and loads of letters to Sir Charles Morgan, a Christmas box for Sir Charles Morgan, the second letter to Sir Charles Morgan. But the primary focus of Frost's writing is attacking this man and what he does. And tell you can't be a gentleman if you have people doing your dirty work like this for you and allow this to happen. Very, very interesting political setup at the time, because again, we in Newport are very, very familiar with the Chartist story and the story of the Chartist uprising. I'm not going to go into a treatise on it now. You can Google Chartist uprising Newport and you will find out all about it. But its roots were very small town. Newport goes from a population of 900 in 1800 up to by about the 1830s. You're looking at a population of 30,000, so it's a massive growth. But at the core, the people running the place were the people who were there right at the beginning, and they knew each other, and they didn't like each other, and they rubbed up against each other, and that personal friction drove a lot of the political arguments of the day. At its core, it was a small town, even though it was a massively burgeoning population.
Yeah. I think do click on our Malpas Court podcast, which I think is actually called Thomas Prothero, isn't it?
It's called The Ghastly Life and Times of Thomas Prothero, though, yeah.
I did try to find kind things about him. But anyway, go and have a look at that, one of the early ones, and see what you think. It is Sir Charles Morgan's fault. He did create this Frankenstein's monster, and then it rampaged over Monmouthshire.
Yeah.
Eventually, he woke up. But by then it was too late, because Prothero had his own empire of his own, and Sir Charles dismissed him after the horse had bolted in 1831. By that time, Sir Charles essentially had a deputation saying, don't stand again for Monmouthshire because you cannot win. The idea of the grand old man of Monmouthshire, you could say, being told that a Morgan can't win Monmouthshire, which was almost unthinkable. But it is what happened, and in many ways, Sir Charles did indeed bring it on himself.
Yeah. We forget the massive political power base they had here. We haven't really touched on it in this episode, but I think, am I right in saying that at one point the Morgans had 4 parliamentary seats more or less in their pocket?
Pretty much. In fact, I've got a quote from Disraeli a little bit later on, which touches on their influence. So you're quite right. Yeah. They're very powerful. They had more seats than a lot of political parties have today.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
One family.
One family interest. Yeah, astonishing.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, this image here was a gift from the last Lady Tredegar, Mrs. York, who died in 2000. And she sent this to the house as a free gift, which was very nice of her. In fact, at the council days, I remember this was released as a Christmas card. Do you remember? You could buy it in the shop.
Yes, right. Yes, that's right. Yes.
Very sounding music, all the kids, in order of
Yeah.
size. 1830s, though, this is. So what you're looking at are not the children of Sir Charles Morgan, but the grandchildren of Sir Charles Morgan, of which he had many. There's still a few coming down from the nursery, as you can see there.
Oh, yes. I've seen the nursery maids. I haven't spotted the babies, yeah.
Oh, yeah. And Sir Charles really, I mean, at this point, he's become, when he enters retirement, and he doesn't really have to, by the way, when he retired, he turned up at Tredegar House with a military escort, bands playing, flags all the way. You know, he wasn't going quietly into that good night. He was going out blaring, you know, trying to tell everyone he was still important, which he was. He owned 40-odd thousand acres at this time. But he was an elderly man at this point. There is a story that he fell in love around this time, always a danger with Sir Charles, very romantic figure, that he fell in love, have I told you this before, Goff, with this French governess, looking at these children. I wonder if one of those governesses, yeah, that had actually come, his father, Sir Charles Gould Morgan, had rescued her from the French Revolution. This is the other thing with the Chartists, of course. Sir Charles Morgan was terrified of revolution because the French Revolution was in living memory. And Juliette Courtenay, who was this governess that his father had rescued, and her brother Frederick. And if this is true, that's very interesting because both Frederick and Courtenay become Morgan names in this period and later on. Yeah. I don't know if it's true or not. That he fell in love with a French governess and had a drawing room wedding. I think the evidence would have come out by now, but I can well believe that Sir Charles had a soft spot for the French governess, let's put it that way. But we're not entirely sure. Sir Charles does leave a legacy, of course. He's not just this man giving mince pies to orphans and unleashing Frankenstein's monsters upon his poor unfortunate tenants. We had that fascinating document, Goff. Do you remember? A chap called Coleman stayed at Tredegar House in 1844 and described in minute detail Sir Charles Morgan's house and how it worked. We used it for a murder mystery, if you remember.
Oh, yes, that's right. Yeah, yes.
It was brilliant. It said all these little details about what time breakfast was, dinner, and all of this, how your room looked. The fact that in one of the corridors there was a little post box with the time on it when it would be sent for the post. I mean, it's fascinating little detail. And if you mentioned anything to Sir Charles, such as, oh, I think I might want to go out riding tomorrow about 10-ish, everything was with military precision. If you said that over dinner, oh, I might go riding about 10-ish, at 10 o'clock the next morning, when the clock struck, there would be a horse outside the side hall entrance, the side door, waiting for you. Your hat was there, your gloves were there. Anything you wanted, Sir Charles provided, and used to carry around in his pocket a list of his servants, 110 long, in order of precedence, that he would delightedly take out and show guests. And if you were very unlucky, he would insist on showing you around the farms of the area. He was known as the farmer's friend, was Sir Charles Morgan. He liked nothing better than a fat cattle, especially shorthorns. The fatter, the better. Unfortunately, yes. Great wobbly, blobby old bulls wobbling up the avenue. You used to leaning against the trees to catch their breath every so often. That's the line I remember. Wheezing up against a tree, the short-horned cattle of Sir Charles Morgan. I have to once say something to him that the animals should have some form of discernible shape. Yes, they thought Sir Charles's cattle were a little too big. But there were some great farms around here. And Sir Charles and the mangel wurzel is quite fun. He tried to introduce the mangel wurzel as cattle feed into Monmouthshire and Shorthorns. But the great farming family in later years, the Strattons of the Dufferin farm, were magnificent with Shorthorns. But we might get them. But we can't talk industry or agriculture or even politics during this quick blast podcast of the various tales with the Morgan family. I'll just say that thanks to Sir Charles, Commercial Road, Commercial Street, the Tredegar Wharf Company, the development of Pill, the cattle market, and Sir Charles Morgan's show with the fattest cattle you're ever likely to see started at Cortabella Farm and later morphed into the nationally important Tredegar Agricultural Show of later years. Dear old Sir Charles Morgan, eh? And of course, today the people of Newport treat him with the respect and dignity that the man deserved. There he is, man of destiny, Sir Charles Morgan, gazing off into the middle distance. All the great things he will do, all the great pies he will give to orphans at Christmas time.
Yay! Good old Sir Charles. Bollard on his head as usual.
Yeah, it's kind of like a Newport tribute in many
I
ways.
think the bollard should be protected as much as the statue now. I think it's
The
been
listed
so
traffic
long.
cone.
Yeah.
Grade 2.
The traffic cone should be on top of his little head. It should be left there permanently now. It's what he does.
Well, this, of course, was originally in Old Man's Park, and they used to say if you went into Old Man's Park after dark, Sir Charles got off his plinth and chased you.
Yes, chased you around, yeah.
Now he's near the pubs and the clubs. He stays safely on his plinth, doesn't he?
Yeah, out of the way, yeah.
All right, well, Sir Charles is a major Morgan character, and he is the only Morgan to have a statue in Newport.
Yes.
But he was very famous. Out of all of them, if you said Sir Charles Morgan in the 19th century, everyone knew who you were talking about.
Yeah.
Had a fair number of kids. Now, me and Goff have talked about the next chap, one of his kids. Oh, again, this ego. Sir Charles called 3 of his sons after himself.
Oh, yeah.
There was Charles Morgan Robinson Morgan. Sounds like a firm of solicitors, but remember, he was born when it was Charles Morgan Robinson Gould, 1792, before they changed the name. There was Charles Augustus Morgan, who was rector at Machen, which is where all the previous Morgans are buried, aren't they, Goff?
Yes. Well, we think first dynasty Morgans, we like to think of
First dynasty.
Second dynasty Morgans.
The Gould Morgans are very different. I mean, they're even buried in a different place, aren't they?
Oh, yeah, they're buried totally at St. Basil's Church, back at St. Basil's Church in the crypt there.
Yeah, and there's Charles Octavius Swinnerton Morgan. They went by their middle names, of course, they did, apart from the eldest son. But Octavius lived at that house that I mentioned was given over to Louisa, the widow of the last Morgan, John Morgan.
Yeah.
Prothero lived there for a bit, and Octavius, possibly to get rid of the stench of evil. No, it's because he had different things. Basically rebuilt the friars. It's still there. And here it is to this day. It's the back of the Royal Gwent Hospital today. It was said that Octavius rebuilt it and filled it with Tudor furniture, more interesting than useful.
Yes, yeah.
And here we have Octavius Morgan's home. He had this incredible collection of, papal keys. He had, papal rings, chamberlain's keys, astronomical instruments, clocks, watches. He was the chair of the Chilean Antiquarian Society. He owned so much. My favorite thing that he owned, however, was this, which is the Schlossheim Galleon.
Yeah.
From 1585. The idea this thing would actually sail down your dining room table.
Yeah. Just in case you haven't spotted it, this is actually a clock.
It's a clock.
You can see the clock face in the middle there. Yeah, this is an astonishing clock, because obviously Octavius was a major horologist. Not only did he sort of collect these very extravagant Renaissance pieces, but he maintained them and functioned them, everything. He was a very, very clever man when it regards to this type of work. And his clock collection is now in the V&A, am I right? His
British Museum.
British Museum, I beg your pardon. Yeah, so yeah, this is an astonishing thing. Yeah, he would actually sail down the dining table and the cans would go off as well, wouldn't they? The real puff.
It's amazing.
Out of them. Astonishing pieces.
And he bought this in 1866 and he thought, it's too good not to be seen by people.
Yeah.
So he bought it in 1866, and in 1866 he gave it to the British Museum so people could see it.
Oh gosh, straight away.
So it wasn't his death, it wasn't his will. Like a lot of if you see the clock and watch collection at the British Museum today, a lot of it is founded on the incredible collection put together by Octavius Morgan. But this wasn't. This was just, this is too good for people not to see it. And he gave it in 1866. It's brilliant. The Schlossheim Galleon.
Yeah.
He had an incredible collection, this man. Let's see a picture of him. Here he is, Octavius Morgan.
Yeah.
Now, Goff, Octavius Morgan. Reginald Blewett, if it was Reginald Blewett, in this book, this scandalous book that we talked about in the previous podcast called Memories of Monmouthshire, he had some views on this man, didn't he?
He did. Now, I'm going to try and bring it up. Hang on a minute. Here we go. Yeah, this is an extract from Memories of Monmouthshire about Octavius. And it says, Mr. Octavius Morgan, as a young man, was vain, flippant, and conceited. Like the Morgans, he was a pygmy in stature, of a pale, languid complexion, rather effeminate. Although he could converse volubly on most subjects, his voice was squeaky. He delivered his opinions in a dogmatic, overbearing, and arrogant manner. He was a great favourite of his father, during whose lifetime he ruled the roost at Tredegar. Here he preferred to sponge on his father rather than seek his fortune in the church, at the bar, in medicine, or commerce. However, his life was not spent in idleness. He was first to rise in the morning and supervised personally the domestic arrangements. Woe to the lazy footman or tardy housemaid who were late for the day's work. He saw that the horses and cattle were properly attended to and fed, and personally fed the chickens. He made tea for his parents' breakfast, spreading honey and butter on the dry toast for the young ladies, and made copies of the dinner menu, assisting the butler in decanting and icing the wines. The housekeeper admitted that he was quite at home in a syllabub and glorious in a trifle. Many a piece of confectionery enriched with silver frostwork and clever designs of almond paste and barley sugar were designed and made by him. In the kitchen, all the soups, sauces, stews, and curries were subject to his fastidious approval, and a new entree of his was unanimously adopted as a standing family dish, and called a cervelle de veau la mode de Tredegar. Indifferent at sports and other manly amusements, he sought his recreation in the drawing room, reading a page or two from the latest novel, helping to unravel a skein of silk, or whispering sweet nothings in the ear of some impatient Desdemona who had never wished that heaven had made her such a man. At night he lit the bed candles for the ladies and provided them with curl papers. I feel persuaded that, had he offered to assist at her nocturnal toilette, the youngest and fairest of the Tredegar visitors, the most punctilious mother would have said with a smile, "Never mind, dear, it's only Octavius."
Oofed.
It is. Oh, what a bit. What a piece. Just to explain, cervelle de veau la mode Tredegar was in fact calf's brains. Something
Nice.
we've probably fallen out of the popular taste, I should imagine, at the moment. There's a subtext to all of this, which is very, very interesting. And also, we know his mother died within a year, quite young. Octavius essentially takes over the role of the mistress of Tredegar House.
Yeah.
A lot of the things he's depicted as doing there, people at the time would have known that that's the sort of thing that should have been done by the lady of the house, not by a young man. It shows his busyness and his particularity of wanting to do things. There's another quote about Octavius as well, which is quite intriguing. It wasn't in this text, but I've read it elsewhere. It says that he, though unfailingly polite to his inferiors, he delighted in being rude to his equals.
Yeah.
And that's quite interesting. So the Morgans were brought up with this idea that you had to be, polite and decent to the servants and the other. But the fact that he was so deliberately rude to the other people showed that he didn't really no real contempt for them. Really, I don't think he didn't feel part of them. So he's definitely this sort of slight outsider figure. Very early. He was engaged, I understand, to a German countess at one point. Isn't that Paul? Right, Paul?
He wasn't quite engaged. It was thought that he was going to marry this German baroness. Yeah. I think it highly suspicious that the German baroness that he was linked with had an incredibly impressive clock collection.
Yeah, he was just gagging to get his hands on her clocks when he.
In the end, he did not marry the German baroness.
No, well, he never married at all. He was the eighth son. He was the favourite of Sir Charles. He said he was sort of indulged, but he put all his time into his academic pursuits.
Yeah,
and he became a very, very prominent academic in the period as well. Am I right?
Well, yeah, a very well-respected historian, especially local historian.
Yeah,
I think we've talked about this in the past. I think we have a slightly higher opinion of Octavius as a historian than some people seem to do today.
Well,
I'm quite,
there is an academic snobbery about the Victorian academics who basically, but they didn't have the understanding that we have of things. So you tend to dismiss everything they do as it's just being romanticized or whatever. But what we know from what Octavius was doing with the Morgan family history that he researched quite extensively and Housey extensively, was he was quite capable of dismissing things as being nonsense as well. He wasn't taking everything on board. Also, there's an idea that he sort of mythologized the family and that he wanted to sort of big it up. It doesn't quite hang together, that theory. It does to a degree, but also this wasn't his direct line family. This was his his grandmother's family line. So he's actually finding out about the first dynasty Morgans and routing them within that line through. So he's actually did a lot of original research on the family during those periods, and he was quite capable of saying things were not were rubbish. He dismisses various family trees that are done. He does a lot of things. So I think he's a little unfairly treated as an academic and a historian. Also, because he was fantastically unpopular.
Yeah.
He was not a popular figure. He was not liked amongst his own group of people. And he really did behave quite disgracefully during the Chartist uprising, because he was one of the people advocating for the hanging, drawing and quartering as an act of treason. Because basically, John Frost had been attacking his father for years in letters and various things. And he was just, he gallops back from London so he can get there, so he can get as a justice of the peace, he can get on the tribunals doing this. So he was certainly partisan when he came to that, and he was certainly not necessarily a very pleasant man. But even when he's talking about that, he's judging his opinion on that from academic study. There's no, what he said, I have never read of a population rising with no reason to do so. Because he thinks there's no reason to do so. Everything's perfect. We're all benign. We love you. So the idea of suffrage was not necessary to him because they weren't suffering, according to him. So, so he doesn't come across very well during that point of view. He was a waspish man. He was a rude man. He certainly was not on the side of the angels when it comes to the Chartists. But we have to balance that. You don't rubbish everything about someone. I think there were things that Octavius was an absolute specialist in. The one big thing as well is, remember, now, what was the society? Was he fellow of the Royal Society? I can't remember now. Paul?
Royal Society of Antiquaries.
Fellow of the Royal Society of Antiquaries. Right. So he was pretty high up in the academic establishment of the day. But also Faraday used to send him papers for review. Yeah. He can't have been an idiot if you've got one of the leading scientists of the period sending him academic papers for review. So I think we do need to get away perhaps our personal dislike and our political dislike of the man and not allow that to impact on what we think about his academic achievements.
I tell my tour of the cellars and the attics would be a lot worse if it wasn't for Octavius Morgan's work. I know that much.
Oh, yeah, we put a lot, yeah.
But his elder brother, Charles Morgan Robinson Morgan, again, not a particularly likable character. I mean, these children are not... So Charles Morgan is this beaming sun of a man, radiating warmth whether you agree with him or not. He just wouldn't listen to you if you disagreed with him. But slightly quite charismatic. But a lot of his sons aren't, God.
No.
Octavius wasn't. Charles Morgan Robinson Morgan wasn't. But it's Charles Morgan Robinson Morgan who in 1859 gets the peerage.
Yes.
He's made first Baron Tredegar. And he did a mixed political record. I mean, in 1818, he had the most expensive election campaign Brecon had ever known. We're losing to Colonel Wood, who was brother-in-law to Lord Castlereagh. He lost by 26 votes, and it cost £40,000. In 1832...
That's astronomical amount.
Indeed. He lost Brecon boroughs to Colonel Watkins by 6 votes. I think a lot of that is down to the fact that if you met him, you didn't want to vote for him. It sounds harsh, but if they'd kept him away, he probably would have done better. Just basked in his father's glow, the farmer's friend and all that. I mean, he continued a lot of his father's work, and actually the estate continued to make money when he did become Lord Tredegar. He was the president of the Royal Agricultural Society, the Monmouthshire Railway Company, He made sure there was a pension for old Tredegar estate workers. chairman of the Alexandra Dock Company. But he was, according to what we think is Blewett, he was a hypochondriac.
Yes.
Convinced he was going to die. Every year he paid heavy life insurance premiums, convinced this would be the year that he would die. It came as a great surprise when he lived to the age of 82.
Oh, gosh. I knew he lived to an age. I didn't realize he got into his 80s.
But how did they get the peerage? Well, yeah, they were stacking the lords with favourable peers, and he was extremely rich and wealthy. But of course, it's who you know. And he had a long-running friendship back from the younger days from Mary Ann Evans, who became Mrs Disraeli. And there's these very sort of racy sort of poems that she sent him that have survived, you know. I'm not going to say some of them because we don't have time, but I'll just read you this little bit and see what you think. This is her writing to him. Exhibit then your splendid foot, to say nothing of the ankle to it. Display thy costly gem so rare, rivaled alone by arms so fair. On Thursday let thy blue eyes glance with mercy on Tredegar manse. Champagne, they say, is good for youth, and never fails to speak the truth. Regale yourself with Christmas pies, but drink to me only with thine eyes.
Heaven's sake.
It's a little... she makes a nightcap for him and then writes a poem about seeing him wearing it. It really is.
I'd like you to imagine you're in bed wearing the nightcap. Oh, I know. It's outrageous for a Victorian married lady to send these things, isn't it?
Yes. And then, of course, in 1861, Mrs Disraeli and Benjamin Disraeli stay at Tredegar House. And that's what that wonderful tale is. There was a bed 9 foot square in what is now called the best chamber, but it was the pink bedchamber when Disraeli was there. 9 foot square later became the altar for St. Joseph's School, the altar and the altar rails. But it was said, Disraeli apparently said that the bed was so big in the middle of the night, I lost my wife. But knowing what we know, let's hope that he lost his wife because of the size of the bed and she wasn't padding up the corridor to have a glance at Charlie's nightcap. Disraeli says this, by the way, about Tredegar. Tredegar is a very fine old hall, built by Inigo Jones. Well, of requisite proportion in all its numerous chambers and full of admirable oak carving. National Trust should put that out, shouldn't it? Full of admirable oak carving. Benjamin Disraeli. Lord Tredegar is quite a Welsh prince with flowing hospitality. Disraeli had made him Lord Tredegar by this point. His hall full of his neighbours, the Welsh squires from their castles. Unceasing hunting and fishing in 1,000 torrents. This was not much in my way, but he is an unflinching supporter of mine, with brothers and uncles in the house, returned for the boroughs and the 2 counties, of which he is paramount. He helped me very much in our private business, which was collieries. So basically, Charles Morgan Robinson Morgan helps with the colliery investments. He knows Mary Ann, Mrs Dizzy, from a young age. They're very soft on each other. The peerage comes. You can see why they finally got it.
Yeah.
In later years,
he was an active member of Parliament as well.
No, not really.
More than some of them.
Not really.
Well, not really either. I always thought he was more active in it.
Afraid not. Someone said he once went to, the only reason he went to Parliament once because he was on the way to a hunt. So the idea of him as the great politician, that's why he got the peerage, is unfortunately a fallacy when you look at the facts.
Oh, right. I didn't know that.
He hated London.
Oh, God.
He hated a lot of things, the first Lord Tredegar.
Yeah.
And here he is, because he had very little charisma and charm. He wasn't that much fussed on Wales, really. He saw himself as an English gentleman in direct opposition to what his father had done.
Oh, that's interesting.
Strongly English, the first Lord Tredegar, as opposed to his Welsh father.
Yeah.
So he marries a lady that is full of charisma, Rosamond Mundy. And thank goodness she was there. Yeah. Because she was the one that they basically sent out to repair any damage caused by the first Lord Tredegar. The first Lord Tredegar, by the way, said that there will be no politics ever spoken at the dinner table. It was utterly taboo.
Oh, gosh.
So he's not Machiavellian. He just has really interest in agriculture, but no interest really in politics. How he got the peerage.
Oh, That seems part of the course, isn't it, really?
It does really. Rosamond was I mentioned the Battle of the Saints, where poor John Gould, Sir Charles's younger brother, was killed in 1782.
Yeah.
Well, the great hero of that was Lord Rodney, and Rosamond is his granddaughter.
Oh, right.
Is Lord Rodney in 1782, and this is why Rodney enters the Morgan family as a name. Might have a massive beer barrel in the cellars for many years called Lord Rodney.
Yeah.
Not only that, but one of Sir Charles's daughters does in fact marry the third Baron Rodney. So the Rodneys and the Morgans are intertwined.
Yeah.
Which is
Even
why,
in the 20th century, a Lady Rodney was mistress to Courtney, wasn't she?
and well, remembered, yeah, a Lady Rodney. So Rodneys, the Bridges, and the Morgans are entwined in ways, well, they're very close, aren't they?
Yeah.
And this is an example.
Charlie.
The first Lord Tredegar's eldest son, and the man on whose hopes the Tredegar estate rests, Charles Rodney Morgan, better known to the family as Charlie.
Yeah.
It was said that he was a very, very well brought up young gentleman. He was in the Coldstream Guards, but he had, I think, the misfortune to fall in love, sounds like straight out of Dickens, with Miss Scroop, Adela Mary Scroop from Danby Hall, who was very, her mum was the Jones of Lanarth Court. We have a Lanarth Court podcast if you want to go and see that as well. And he fell in love with her at this ball, and he proposed marriage, and he went up north, and Sir Simon Scroop accepted him. But of course, Gough, there was one problem, wasn't there?
Oh, yes. His father forbid it. No, you're not marrying her, because they were a Catholic family. Yeah. And they did not want estates of this size falling into the hands of Catholic families at this period. So he said, no, you can't marry her. And that was the end of it. So Charlie, having been very well brought up and very well behaved, went off the rails in the grand fashion. Ran off to Paris, took up with a singer, whose name I can never quite remember. Oh, there she is.
Emily Reynaud.
Emily Reynaud, took up with her, devoted his life to wine, women, song, and then died tragically young at the age of 25, burnt out.
1854, yeah.
1854, yeah, 1854, shortly before the charge of the Light Brigade. This will become significant. Yeah.
So poor Charlie, he was MP for Brecon. I'm sure they were very proud of him, just running off with a... Well, she's from Bordeaux, but she made her name on the Parisian stage as a singer.
Yeah.
And Emily Reynaud, and there's an image of her. Isn't that great? There's an image surviving of her, and this was in 1847, a very glamorous character, but her stage career was sort of ruined by this romance. And in many ways, Charlie could have ruined her life, because Charlie got her pregnant.
Yes.
And when Charlie got her pregnant, unfortunately, it coincided with Charlie's illness. So they have 2 children, as far as we know. And Charlie gets very ill very quickly, and he dies, as Gough says, at the age of 25. Emily Reynaud does bounce back. She marries, I think, a stockbroker called Lecomte. She becomes Emily Lecomte, and is actually the maternal grandmother of the famous French artist Jean Cocteau.
Yeah.
So how things might go on, might have altered, it's that fork in the road sort of thing.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Fascinating.
But Charlie dies at the age of 25 in 1854. Now, how many different stories have you heard, Gough, about how Charlie died?
Oh, I can think of at least 2 or 3. One was that he's supposed to have died of a medical condition that had claimed 2 kings of France and 1 pope, that they're euphemistically. Other one that it was drink related, that he basically drank himself to death, and it was sort of a cirrhosis type thing. There's even a family legend that he apparently was shot in battle. They started to spread around, which would be very interesting because we weren't at war with anybody at the time. So what he was doing being shot in battle, I don't know. There is the various accounts, I think, when they say that he was dishabille in mind, in body and spirit.
By the end,
the spirit bit is very interesting because that hints at mental health as well as physical health, from depression or what have you. So we don't really absolutely know exactly. Do we know what Charlie died of?
Why don't we have a stab at this? because clearly the Morgans heard when they brought Charlie back to Basilic Church and buried him, Monmouthshire was awash with these theories and this gossip. So the Morgans, fed up with this, appear to have got in touch with Charlie's physician and made him write out what is essentially an affidavit.
Oh, right.
And I've got that here.
Oh, good Lord. Hey, brilliant. Never seen this before.
So this is April 1854, and it's by Alexander Charge,
Yeah.
who was Charlie's physician in Marseille. And the important bit comes at the end, and I'll read it here because it's very difficult to read. And I certify that he did not die of his own hands, nor by dueling, nor did he suffer death by the hands of justice, but that his death was occasioned by disease of the lungs, to make sure he's bold, after an illness of about 4 months.
Oh, right.
So clearly the Morgans are stung by all these rumors and gossip, and they get his physician Alexander Change of Marseille to put the matter to rest. It clearly only had limited success, this affidavit, didn't it?
Yeah.
Because even in Memories of Monmouthshire, they mentioned the possible syphilis and all of this. So that's Charlie.
Hello, Charlie.
Now, he used to take part in the Tredegar Park races, which you see here, where grandstands in the park would go up and you'd pay your money and you'd watch. Usually in January, so the going must have been extremely firm. Charlie had a very interesting horse, which a friend of his dad was a colonel who bred horses in Ireland. And in Ireland was born a horse called Sir Briggs, and Charlie got his father to buy it for him. But many of the this is a later one. Many of the Tredegar Park races, Charlie rode on his horse, Sir Briggs. Godfrey, his younger brother, rode on his horse, his favourite, Atheist. And Freddie had all kinds of horses. My favourite, following in that Morgan tradition. Do you remember Sir William Morgan's racehorse Slug?
Yes.
Well, Freddie Morgan, the third brother, the third son, had a horse called Sluggard. So that follows in Morgan family history. So sadly, Charlie, the last race Charlie was in, and he did ride Sir Briggs, was 1853. And he descended into that illness, which killed him in Marseille at the age of 25. And so the new heir was, of course, the second son, this very glamorous figure, Godfrey Morgan, the 17th Lancer, one of the dandy boys. And you see him here in uniform. Godfrey Morgan. And as Goff says, in 1854, Charlie dies in January, and Godfrey and Fred, his younger brothers, Godfrey in the 17th Lancers, Fred in the Rifle Brigade, head off to the Crimean War. And Godfrey goes on a ship called the Edmondsbury, and that unfortunately is a sail ship rather than the expected steamer, and horses are not very good with seasickness. It was such an awful trip that Godfrey hated boats from that day on. And
well, he took 4 horses with him. 2 of them died on the way there.
Including Atheist.
Including Atheist. He writes a letter back said about watching them basically drop Atheist's body over the side of the boat into the water. But the horse that did survive is Sir Briggs, who he inherited from Charlie.
His dead brother's horse. So this is a real Welsh war horse story, this, with Sir Briggs, isn't it? Here's Godfrey with Sir Briggs, with the bell tents that the men are in. There wasn't any real shelter for the horses.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And the men had bell tents. And so very famously, we talked about this on a live stream, didn't we? The Battle of Balaclava on the 25th of October, 1854, perhaps better known as the Charge of the Light Brigade portion. Captain Godfrey Morgan, with 80 men in his command, was pretty much at the front, and he charged into the Valley of Death on his dead brother Charlie's horse.
There he is.
There he is.
This is painted very, very, very much later.
By John Charlton, Godfrey's favourite artist. And based on one of Godfrey's sketches, this is.
Oh, yeah, I didn't realise it was based on a sketch of his. Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that.
Based on one of his sketches. And there is Sir Briggs. Godfrey, eventually, we do talk about this. Look out for the live stream on this. But they basically get to the guns, can't hold them, and have to go all the way back through the Valley of Death again. If the Russians didn't get you on the way down, they get you on the way out.
So this is the moment that they get over the guns.
They're at the guns.
At the end of it. In the back corner there, you can actually see Cardigan in the left there, middle left ground, the chap in the tall hat. That's Cardigan.
Yeah.
It's interesting that he's there because after the charge, Godfrey gets actually subpoenaed in a libel case that Cardigan took up because somebody claimed he hadn't gone beyond the guns. He turned back before he'd reached the guns. And Godfrey was one of the witnesses to say, no, he was actually there. So it's interesting that this is Godfrey's sketch, based on Godfrey's sketch, and it does show Cardigan in it over the line. I've never known that before. I knew he was there, but I didn't realise it was based on a sketch of Godfrey's.
It was indeed. So Sir Briggs essentially half stumbles, half jumps over the Russian guns. And remember, there's smoke everywhere. There's shot and shell. And the horse gets him out, basically.
Yeah.
Almost a miracle.
Neither of them had a mark on them.
No. No, not. There was a slight tiny saber cut on Sir Briggs's neck, which led to that urban legend, which wasn't true. But
that he was Mr. Briggs at the start of the charge, and because he'd been cut on the shoulder with a saber, he'd been knighted. So Godfrey made him Sir Briggs. Yeah, no, he was Sir Briggs at the start.
Sir Briggs, when Charlie's dad bought him all those days ago from Ireland, from the Colonel. But Sir Briggs becomes a major character. Here we see him in later years. Near the Edney Gates, this old war horse. I tell you what, Lord Tredegar's still alive there, the first Lord Tredegar. Yeah. So Sir Briggs still has another 3 or 4 years of life left in him.
Yeah.
Finally dies at the age of 28.
Yeah.
And is buried in the Cedar Garden at Tredegar House. And in fact, he is honoured more than many horses, and quite rightly so.
Yeah. Oh, yes, yeah.
Here he is in Gorsedd Gardens in front of the City Hall in Cardiff.
Yeah.
Godfrey, very Errol Flynn on Sir Briggs.
Yeah. And also, that portrait and this statue were actually done roughly at the same time, weren't they? They were right at the end of Godfrey's life at the turn of the 1900s.
Very much so.
They were basically out honouring him before he went, I think. That was the sort of the idea. A lot of honour came to Godfrey right at the end of his life.
Yeah, and in Wales, with us, it usually means you have to die to get a statue.
Yeah, yes.
Whereas Godfrey was so popular, as we'll talk about in a second, he was there at the unveiling by Goscombe John, the great Welsh sculptor. And Godfrey actually said, well, they're not going to remember me, but they might remember Goscombe John, and they might remember the horse Sir Briggs. Godfrey was spot on, because there's another little honour which was fallen upon the horse relatively recently near Imperial Park in the Dufferin part of Newport. We have this.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Sir Briggs Avenue. He has his own, a few horses have a street named after them, yeah.
Other than race horses, I'm sure there's a Desert Orchid Avenue or whatever, but Sir Briggs Avenue for a war horse. So Sir Briggs, with that incredible tale of it being the dead brother's horse, and Godfrey takes on the horse, and he says, I can never be as good as my brother Charlie, and atheist dying, that's a movie, Goff.
Yeah.
That's the Welsh war horse, with all the romance involved.
Yeah.
But, of course, there were other brothers as well, so I just want to mention those before we get on to the last bit, which will be Godfrey. His younger brother, Freddie, so the third son of the first Lord Tredegar, there he is. He was in the Rifle Brigade. But there were 2 younger sons, and I'm sorry to focus on sons in this. The 18th century had a lot of female, strong characters, but for our short period of time, we have to focus on the Tredegar House ones.
Yeah.
A lot of daughters get married off, of course, and people like Lady Hereford and people like that. Lady Walker, who married the Forestier Walkers, was a sister, and she got killed in Cardiff when she was thrown from her carriage.
Oh, gosh.
The Dog and Trap. So very sad in 1887. But there was also Arthur and George, the 2 younger ones. And whenever they talk about the Morgans at these races, they talk about Charles Rodney Morgan, Godfrey, Freddie here. They're very glamorous.
Yeah.
But then you'll sometimes have an Arthur, if he wasn't lame, would be coming up behind them.
Yeah.
George, they don't even talk about.
Yeah.
Here's Arthur.
Yeah.
Always with the stick.
Yeah.
George, his younger brother, was, according to a servant who worked with him, both physically and mentally impaired.
What, George?
George Gould Morgan, the youngest.
Oh, I never knew that.
And so what they did was, in Cambridge Terrace in London, they put a sort of fleet of servants to look after him.
Yeah.
He was epileptic. There's a very good chance that Arthur was epileptic as well. He stood for Parliament for Brecon twice and lost both times, in 1880 and 1885. And on one occasion, he has a series of fits. while on the hustings.
Oh, right. Oh, that's interesting.
He's
Oh, I
always seen as lame.
Yeah.
So basically, my point with this is that the younger two have battles of their own to fight in their life.
Yeah.
It's not just the military.
No.
Fascinating with Arthur, though, because in 1894, so his dad's long gone, there's a servants' ball at Tredegar House. He's there. No one mentions anything. The press don't mention anything. That month, in 1894, Arthur gets married very late in life.
Oh, gosh.
He's in his early 50s. She's a spinster of 49. Her name is Louisa Gammon, and she's a joiner's daughter.
Well.
So whether he clearly marrying for love, not money. But late in life, Arthur finds romance, but it seems as if maybe there were members of the family that didn't approve of the match because it was all kept quiet.
Isn't that interesting?
Certainly is. So they're not all glamorous, but they all have their own path to lead.
And he lived in a house more or less at the corner of the estate, didn't he? And
he spent a lot of his time in Tredegar House, but
it's gone now. But there was a little house right on the corner of the wall, which was only demolished in about the past couple of decades.
And a lot of time in Brighton as well for his health.
Yeah.
In the end, his lungs killed Arthur at the age of 60.
Yeah.
And George lived to the age of about 63 and died in 1906. Arthur died in 1900. First Lord Tredegar eventually dies in 1875, and the press get it wrong. They kill him off a week before he dies. And not only that, my favourite newspaper report is this. And Lord Tredegar has died. He died a week before he did. At Tredegar Park, Newport, the Isle of Wight.
For a hypochondriac to actually outlive his own obituary is quite good, actually.
He'd love to read his own obituary. He was supposed to open the Alexandra Dock in Newport, but he was too ill. And the idea was that his wife Rosamond would open it. But this is a medal which was cast at the time. Lady Tredegar opened the Alexandra Dock, except she didn't. These medals still appear on eBay. It's quite rare because she didn't, because she was at his deathbed.
Oh, right. Oh, I didn't know that.
He was chairman of the Alexandra Dock Company, and
I didn't realize that she couldn't attend because he was ill. I know he couldn't go because he was ill. I didn't realize that he was actually dying when it opened
on his deathbed.
Yeah, good Lord.
Which meant that Lord Tredegar was the second surviving son. It was Godfrey Morgan, John Charlton again, Mr. Barrett the huntsman in front of Tredegar House. And he was an extremely popular Lord Tredegar, wasn't he? The gifts that he gave away. Monmouthshire's single greatest public benefactor, I think it's safe to say.
Oh, yeah, Godfrey seems almost in a way, we discussed it recently, he seems to have had almost a degree of survivor's guilt in a way. And one of the way he sort of assuaged this was by being incredibly generous and philanthropic with his money, almost as if he didn't think he quite deserved to have that amount. So he spread it around, and he gave a tremendous amount of public park spaces to places. I mean, a whole lot of the places around the valleys up and down here, and in Newport, particularly with Bellevue Park. He gave parks. He gave land for technical colleges, art schools. They say to attend the opening of an envelope if you saw it. I mean, he didn't have a secretary, so he dealt with everybody directly, no matter what social class they were at the time. And if the people, they were terribly conscious of that. So he might be receiving letters from Equitable Life Assurance as one of its chairmen at one point, and then also letters from a little kid in Pill for the local football club and sending him a £5 to buy balls. So he really made himself part of this area and this world and the people around him. He was very old-fashioned in the terms of sort of Welsh patriarchal landowners, and sees himself very much in that way. He was a very much loved figure. Even when the socialist movement in Newport at one point said socialism will never thrive while Lord Tredegar is alive.
He was very popular, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was a very, very popular figure.
And it was good for councils at the time as well, because they basically said, if they needed an extra bit of land for a park or the widening of a road, they just went to Godfrey, who would more often than not give it to them.
Yeah,
he did say that as we grow less ornamental, we must grow more useful. As the hairs fall off our head, we have to be more useful. Although he did say a philanthropist was a man who was essentially didn't mind his pocket being picked.
Yes, yeah. An elderly gentleman, usually bald, who delights in having his pocket picked. Yeah,
but he gave lots of land. I mean, lots of land. You can see why he became this enormously popular. Cardiff were desperate for him to become the mayor, but he would never do it. Glamorgan and Monmouthshire fell over themselves to give him honours towards the end of his life. He was made a Viscount, next step up from Baron, in 1906, and made the first freeman of Newport. He was a freeman of Cardiff. The statue was put up in Cardiff that we showed you. So for this period, from 1875 to 1913, or 1909 at least, it was Godfrey and Fred, the most famous people in Monmouthshire. So there's Godfrey in front of Tredegar House, and there's Fred in front of Rupera Castle, where the heir would live, because Godfrey, as we'll say in a second, has not married at this point. So his younger brother Fred is the heir to the Tredegar estate. This is Fred's daughter Violet. We'll talk more about that on our last podcast on the 20th century. Violet was a force of nature. Violet is essentially Princess Anne, but transported back to the 19th century. Violet, there's a great thing. Violet plays cricket. Violet's playing cricket in Newport, and there's the loudest voice shouting her on is her Uncle Godfrey, or Uncle Goff. Uncle Goff. And Uncle Goff is basically shouting in that elegant way, of course, of the British aristocracy, "Leg it, Vi!" Leg it.
Leg it, Vi.
This is John Charlton as well. And let's have a look. The Western Mail, of course, did this Wit and Wisdom of Lord Tredegar. You can find the book live online with these wonderful little cartoons of Godfrey's adventures. And a couple of them I'll show you now, because they do help sum up Godfrey perhaps better than we can do. We start off with this one. My brother and I had a fine-looking animal. We used to smoke our cigars as we gazed at it. Godfrey and Fred. This is when he went to an auction. One, It was at that point that a blue bottle settled on my nose.
Because he's at an auction, isn't he? And he ends up buying a horse because he's trying to get a fly on his nose.
He ends up buying something, doesn't he?
Yeah, that's a wonderful picture. Yeah.
You tried to blow me up on my way to Tredegar House. Is his what he thinks of bonfire night? He was never sure about bonfire night because, of course, they tried to blow up the House of Lords, which, as a member, he wasn't too keen on.
Yeah.
And he actually said that they call the House of Lords the hereditary non-entities.
Yeah.
He said, I can't do anything about the first part, but I've tried all my life to make sure I'm not a non-entity.
None of the non-entities.
I believe I've laid more foundation stones than any other man in England. He did lay a lot of foundation stones, and he did open a lot of church fêtes and bazaars, didn't he?
Oh, yeah. You find his name's on foundation stones all over Newport, all over the place. Particularly latter part when it's again that boom period of the late 19th century.
But his public perception often puzzled him. Surely this is not I. He would read things like Godfrey the Good and all the praise that was thrown on him. And I think it confused him ever so slightly. Yeah,
he didn't. They said, I've been referred to, the mayor's referred to me as Godfrey the Good. Well, I don't know about that. And that's quite, I think it's interesting. He didn't, I always get vaguely rattled if people refer to him as Godfrey as Good in the house now, in Tredegar House, because I know full well he didn't like that. He didn't like that at all. He was comfortable with it. So I think, like, what
is that survivor's guilt again, Goff?
Possibly. He said on one occasion in the Wit and Wisdom, he's recorded as saying, because he'd go to these functions and he would just talk off the cuff, basically, to people. And on one occasion, he said he'd never had a happy dream.
Yeah.
He'd never woken with a smile on his lips, though he had frequently woken with a tear on his cheek. And he kept up a lifelong association with the other survivors of the charge. He used to have the balaclava dinner at the Tredegar Arms in Basilisk every year while he was alive, and it was carried on afterwards as well by Courtney, his nephew, carried it on. But I think he did. I think he had a sort of hygiene thing as well, because he'd wound up in Scutari Hospital, so he's definitely said everything had to be spotlessly clean. Table linen was changed for every meal, bed, everything. The laundry operated every day at Tredegar House while he was alive, so everything's had to be spotlessly clean. And I think he did. He and also people never let him forget the charge of the Light Brigade. It goes on and on and on for him, So he's never allowed to forget that he was at it. On one occasion, he says, though, he was at some regimental sort of dinner, and he says that one of the other old boys are talking about how many people they killed during the war. And Godfrey said up and said, as far as I know, I didn't actually kill anybody. And I rather hope I didn't.
Yeah.
I mean, that is, and he's very realistic about war and quite anti-war. He does a fascinating speech when he comes back from the Crimea as a young man. It took him 2 years to thread his way back across Europe because he wouldn't come back on the boat. And also he is ill and he is recovering on his way home. So it took him a long time to get back to health. When he comes back to the park, he speaks at one of the shows, agricultural shows, and he talks about I have seen the devastation that an army creates on a landscape, and that sounds very interesting. What he's talking about, however, is his own army. He's not talking about the enemy. He's talking about us. So he wasn't a gung ho military figure of the 19th century. He thought war was an awful thing and it shouldn't happen, and that's fascinating.
He got out of the army pretty quickly after the charge of the Light Brigade. He said, I might bring my elderly father to the grave.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Just first Lord Tredegar didn't want him to go back, so he didn't go back.
But yeah, they gave him all this. I love this. What have I done to deserve this? He's being hugged by Monmouthshire. Isn't that nice?
Yeah.
That actually was not the portrait they gave him. They did give him £2,000, which he immediately gave to charity.
Yeah.
They did make him the first ever freeman of Newport. He said, well, that's great. I've read about this. It means I can't get hanged in Newport. When he went there was a part of Tredegar Park that technically wasn't in Newport, so he could be hanged from one of his own trees.
He makes a fascinating statement of that speech when he says that I do like to be amongst my own people.
Yeah.
But his own people are the people of Monmouthshire and the people of Newport and the people of, not just his immediate family. No. He definitely has that. He's very rooted in this part of the world. He says some very fascinating things as well at one of the Christmas dinners. Because he lived on his own in Tredegar House, which we will come on to.
And his 22 servants.
With his 22. So, you know what I mean? He lived on his own. He wasn't married. He had no children. There was no other family in there with him apart from him and the 22 servants. But one of the servants' balls at the end, he says, I do wish that you would consider me as one of your own. Yeah. That's an astonishing statement for a 19th century aristocrat to make. To say to the servants, I wish you think of me as one of you. That is a very, very fascinating setup. He didn't have those social distancing things. He used to go every year to the annual cabman's dinner because he believed in supporting the cab. So he would catch a cab back from the railway station rather than use his own carriage. And the cabman loved him, and he'd go along. They would say, well, why on earth are you dining with the cabman? And he said, well, I can dine with a duke or an earl any day of the week, but I frequently get a chance to dine with a cabman.
Yeah.
So then he reckoned half the stories in Newport were made up by cabmen anyway. There's a lovely story a female friend of his told him, is that she's driving up along the road through St. Julian's to Caerleon, and she looks across and sees the top of Tumbalum Mountain, which has a mound on top of it. And she points to it. She says, what is that mountain? And the cabman goes, oh, that's where Lord Tredegar buried his horse.
Yeah. My favourite cabman's story is when they pass Newport Castle and they say, well, what's going to happen to it? And the cabbie says, don't you know, Lord Tredegar's bought it. He's going to turn it into a shelter for retired cabmen. Godfrey said only a cabman could come up with that particular tale. You see him here in his Lord Lieutenant of Monmouthshire uniform. He really was the premier citizen of Monmouthshire, powerful in Breconshire as well, and parts of Glamorgan. I mean, they own 7,000 acres of Glamorgan, especially the east of Cardiff. So Splot, Roath, that was all Tredegar territory.
Oh, interesting.
A lot of the parks in Splot, Waterloo Gardens and all of that was gifted by the Morgans, by Godfrey. But as he gets older, the one thing he didn't have was love.
No.
Now, he did have an understanding, it would seem, with a young lady. There's a mystery about why the understanding didn't actually go ahead, called Mitty Thorough. And Mitty Thorough was the love of his life. Even Reggie Herbert mentions Mitty Thorough in one of his books. Reggie Herbert says she was very good to look at, in a Leslie Phillips sort of way.
Yeah, there's a very Reggie remark.
So there's something special about Mitty. They were so special, it doesn't seem as if Godfrey ever looked at any other woman. Problem is, when he comes back from the Crimea, Mitty has agreed, and there was a gap, so there's something has gone on here, we don't know about it. Because in 1856, Mitty doesn't marry Godfrey. Mitty marries this chap, Richard Christopher Naylor. Very rich man, 20 years older than her, but a very, very rich man. who owned Houghton Hall in Cheshire and later Kelmarsh in Northamptonshire. And it's the great what if, this, isn't it, really, Goff?
Oh yeah, it's
Mitty chose
fascinating.
him.
It's fascinating. There were various reasons that she might have chose him. Godfrey apparently didn't reply to her letters, so she apparently, so she got miffed that he didn't reply to her letters when he was in the Crimea.
They didn't get to her.
He didn't get the letters. He didn't actually get the letters. Yeah, so that was another one. But also, when during the charge, some of the Bristol papers had reported that he died in the charge. So it takes him 2 years to get home.
Well, not quite 2 years.
Well, almost.
He's back in 1855.
Okay. Oh, well, that's a year.
So it takes quite a few months. Yeah.
So 18 months then. So it takes him a long time. So you got the huge gap for him coming home. She thinks he's dead. And Naylor is part of the county set, part of the county horse racing set and circuit. Because as well as the hunt, you had the horse racing fraternity. A lot of the ruling families bred their own racehorses. So there's lots of accounts of Naylor and Mitty and Reggie Herbert from Clither and all the people all in the same sort of circle prior to the going off to the war and what have you. So when Godfrey comes back, she does decide to stick with this agreement that she's made to marry Naylor. Now, an uncharitable individual would say that essentially she's playing the odds. Naylor's 20 years older than her, so he's very well off. So she thinks, oh, he's going to die before me. Once he's died, I'll marry Godfrey. Because Godfrey makes it perfectly clear to her and to him and to Naylor that he's not given up any intention towards marrying Mitty. So basically, more or less says to him, I'm going to wait for you to drop off the twig. Basically, we're going to wait for you to die, and then we'll get married. And he keeps this close relationship with Mitty throughout their life. Now, if it started as a vague bit of gold digging with Mitty, which an uncharitable person could say it was, it certainly isn't that by the end, because they are still in this relationship, whatever it was, platonic relationship or what have you, 30 years later, when she dies, because Naylor outlives her.
By 10 years.
By 10 years. So the big plan doesn't work out for them, isn't that she dies before Naylor dies. When they're in their 50s as well. Godfrey's 54, I think, or so, when she passes away.
Yeah, she died at 52 in Monte Carlo.
Yeah, she died at 52 in Monte Carlo. So by the end of it, these are mature people who have had a lifelong relationship, whatever that relationship is or was. They know that she used to visit Tredegar House regularly. So her daughters used to visit the house regularly. Naylor never came. Godfrey would sometimes go up to their property when Naylor wasn't there. Naylor certainly had suspicions that it was not platonic relationship. He seems to be convinced that one of his daughters was Godfrey's, if not both of them. And he put a private detective on Godfrey as well at one point to try and find out what was going on between him and Mitty.
Yeah.
Just knows what that report was. We never saw it.
No.
It's intriguing. Now, does this cloud Godfrey's reputation as a good man? No, of course he doesn't. Of course he doesn't at all. You know, it's a fact. It's someone who loved an individual and was unable to let go of that and kept it going, and it just didn't work out for either of them the way it worked. They could have worked. But the daughters sort of story is interesting. You've got a bit more on this, haven't you, Paul?
Yeah, well, we're going to have to wrap up pretty soon because we've gone on very long.
Oh, have we?
Way over the schedule.
Okay.
But that's all right. I mean, people can dip in and out. Yeah, I mean, when Mitty Naylor died, Mitty Thorough as was, Godfrey did say that he felt himself then free of all obligations. So I think he was free of obligation when she married someone else, but he didn't see it that way. He said, I've stood for so long on the precipice of marriage, I can now peer over the edge without fear of falling. But there were these two Naylor daughters. We've got the eldest one, who was Mitty the younger. And Mitty the younger became Lady Rossmore, lived to the age of 94. And in a book, Things I Can Tell by Her Husband, he writes about Mr. Naylor and says, Richard Christopher Naylor was somewhat cross-grained and eccentric, and he successfully made his own life unhappy and other people's as well. Mr. Naylor had two charming daughters who were ever so nice to him, but he always suspected their motives whenever they displayed any affection towards him.
Oh, God.
Now, again, why is he doing this? So we've got Mitty, the eldest there, the eldest daughter, and then we've got Dudes Naylor.
Dudes?
Dudes, yeah. Her name was Mary, but her nickname was Dudes Naylor.
Oh, gosh.
She was the one that turned up at Tredegar House at the servants' ball, was very close to Godfrey.
Sadly, well, she came down the
stairs
stairs with the family, which is quite extraordinary.
With the family. She later married very late in life, and as soon as she married, the poor bloke got killed in a hunting accident. So poor Dudes Naylor didn't have much luck in love. But again, Lord Lanova seems to think that Godfrey was, quote, making a fool of himself over Mitty Naylor, which suggests that he was not prepared to let her go, and didn't appear to have let her go until that terrible day in Monte Carlo, 1889, when his love died at the age of 52. But then he maybe saw her in the daughters and certainly looked after them, taught them to ride, taught them both to ride, especially Dudes. So we'll never know. So Godfrey ends up as the most popular lord in Wales, quite frankly. And here he is with memories towards the end. Peeps the dog. You got the shabrack or the saddlecloth of Sir Briggs, his horse, his charger, his dead brother Charlie's horse. There's so many memories wrapped up there. And in 1911, it appears he suffers a stroke, and he was never quite the same then for the last 2 years of his life. He dies in 1913, and this is his last journey through Tredegar Park on a terribly wet day. And the crowds were about 5 deep at points. If you told anyone at that church that in 40 years the Tredegar story would come to an end, nobody would believe you. Western Mail, Thursday, March 13th, 1913. Their tribute cartoon to Godfrey. So you've got politics, you've got agriculture, you've got society, and they're all there paying tribute to Godfrey. They didn't really see
the poem is very Welsh as well.
Welsh
rest,
with a
rest, noble dead, serenely sleep in tear-swept Cymru's love. Perchance thy shade its watch shall keep her mountain heights above. For long as Gwalior's mountains stand, thy name shall live in Gwalior's land.
Well, Gwalia was very much a romantic Victorian word for Wales at the time, which was very popular. They did think, I mean, Godfrey did pay for the Heirlas horn, which is still used at the Eisteddfod to this day, which has got the Tredegar crest on it. Still used. He paid about £300 then for it. And, oh no, very much so. Very much so. And in fact, they put Godfrey together with his grandfather, Sir Charles Morgan. They're always coupled together as great supporters of Welsh institutions. They were both called at various times Ifor Hael II. If you wonder who Ifor Hael is, check part 1 of this mammoth Tredegar House series of podcasts. So we end with the death of Godfrey in 1913. Viscount Tredegar is dead. So who is next to walk through those doors? And how will they deal with the 20th century? And how will they deal with the enormous new danger, death duties, which haunted the family? So there we are, Goff. This is a mammoth one. This is the longest video, I think, easily we've ever done. So if you've stayed with us to this point, thank you very much. And, I hope you'll stay for the next time where we dip into the 20th century. And just a quick, what do they expect from the 20th century for part 4, Goff?
We have gentlemen gentlemen of leisure, hunting, shooting, fishing, sailing the world in great yachts. We have poets, occultists. We have lay chamberlain to the Catholic Church, defender the popes. And we have a final outing altogether, bobbing up and down on the yacht in Monte Carlo Harbour.
So there we are. So much to look forward to.
Don't have to bother reading. Don't bother watching the next one. You've had it all there.
Oh, you want to catch the next one. This is where it gets very interesting, very dark, and very scandalous. What would Godfrey say? So thank you very much for watching, and we'll be back with you very soon. Our next video will be on another property, but keep a lookout for part 4. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.